All right, I think we'll get started. We may get people joining us as we continue, but we'll get started. It's just a few minutes after 7 o'clock. On behalf of Baltimore Sister Cities, I welcome everyone. I'm Karen Leggett, co-chair of the Baltimore-Luxor-Alexandria Sister City Committee. BSC represents Baltimore's 8 sister cities: Alexandria and Luxor, Egypt; Changwon, South Korea; Banga, Liberia; Kawasaki, Japan; Piraeus, Greece; Rotterdam, Netherlands; and Xiamen, China. And I would like to note that it was the Xiamen Sister City Committee that worked with its counterpart in China to provide a huge delivery of personal protective equipment to Baltimore during this current pandemic. And on that note, we certainly wish everyone continued vigilance and good health. And wherever we came from, when we are living and working in Baltimore, we acknowledge that we are on the land of the Piscataway Nation. The link to our website is in the chat, and we urge you to visit if you're interested in learning more about any of these committees, our activities, and of course, opportunities to participate, volunteer, or donate. Tonight, we're joining the critical national discussion of race as it applies to all of us here in Baltimore, those born here, those who immigrated here, all of us who live here now or have an important connection to the city. Social worker and author Brene Brown has listed 4 requirements for empathy, a quality we would certainly hope to be nurturing tonight. Perspective, the ability to see life from another person's point of view; no judgment, understanding another person's feelings, and communicating that understanding. And we have 3 BSC members who will be sharing their perspectives with you tonight. Teresa Leslie, Vice Chair, Baltimore-Rotterdam Sister City Committee; Diana Zilberman, BSC Education Champion; Geri Byrd, the Mayor's Office Representative and BSC Vice President, who is being joined by her colleague John Wesley, Public Information Officer for the Mayor's Office of Equity and Civil Rights. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll address the questions at the end of all the presentations. And this webinar will be recorded, and we'll send everyone a link and make it available soon after the presentation on BSC Inc. on the YouTube page. Teresa Leslie is our first speaker this evening. Before coming to Baltimore, Teresa spent 8 years working and conducting research in the Caribbean Netherlands. She began contrasting her experiences of racism in the Dutch Caribbean with her experiences in the United States, creating the first Raising the Curtain on Race conference on the island of St. Eustatius. Teresa graduated from Howard University and the University of South Carolina, earning her PhD at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Teresa, let me get your slides. And you need to unmute.
Okay, that's good. As soon as the slides come up. I guess I could take this time to thank the Baltimore Sister Cities for supporting Raising the Curtain on Race. As I said, it was something that I started while living on St. Eustatius, but in the Caribbean Netherlands, but it did travel to the island of St. Martin the year after, and then we skipped a year due to the hurricanes that kind of devastated the island of St. Martin and went to Curacao. And I see a few of the people from Curacao on in the participant list, and I'm happy that you could join today. So this is a continuing discussion that we've been having, and I'm very happy that it's being continued here in Baltimore. One of the reasons I moved to Baltimore was because of some of the issues surrounding race that I saw, and it was the city that I decided to move to because I felt I could make a contribution. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is global racism. Not specifically in Baltimore, but how my experiences traveling, I have seen that racism expresses itself while differently, it's nevertheless racism. If you can move to the next slide, and I could tell you a little bit more about Raising the Curtain on Race. And one of the things that I am concerned with is that is the legacy of people. People have been discriminated against due to racist practices, but along with this is a legacy of resistance. And I think we need to pay attention to that legacy of resistance. So RCR, which is the acronym, does not envision itself doing anything particularly new, but rather we follow in the footsteps of people before us, I will talk about, such as Du Bois, who have come before us and paved the way for us. And we must respect and commemorate them. And in this era of innovation, we need to use them and innovate through them moving forward. And it's a lot of work to do. So we are bridging, what we want to do is bridge across countries, across traditional boundaries to build. So if you could go to the next slide. In the global north, what I see, and I'm just working on these ideas, is we have what we say racism and fascism, which is more of a European phenomenon. But I was reading Wilkinson's new book, Caste, and it's interesting that she discusses race fascism of Europe and states how in Germany particularly, they looked to the United States and looked at Jim Crow practices to model what they did during the Nazi era. But in the global South, while people may not use the terms racism and fascism, you have colonialism. And it's these things that we're trying, the common link between these things is white supremacy. So the idea that white people are superior or dictate
we're losing
that my book, which is discussing
Teresa, we're losing
that resemble colonial practices. But let's go on and just kind of discuss generally what racism is. Racism changes where you go. So what I experience here in the US is definitely different than what I experienced when I was living abroad. And what's interesting is that these types of forums we should be happy about, that we're able to have forums like this and discuss racism. But I think it's interesting to look at how racism expresses itself across boundaries and compare them and people coming together to talk about race in their particular context and compare it and try and overcome it in that way. And I do think that in order to fight against racism and white supremacy, we really do need to be thinking globally, not just within our particular context, but sharing our context with others. We can go to the next slide. So I think we did want to make this a little personal. And just so you know, I grew up in New York on Long Island. When I was growing up, we were probably one of the few African-American, I would say the only African-American family living in the neighborhood that I lived in. And one of my first experiences with racism was my brother and I, we went probably where we weren't supposed to go, over to a friend's house. And their mother screamed through the window that we should leave and never come back. Oh, so we went home and we talked to our parents about it. We were in the car, and there was a little altercation, like a little yelling back and forth. And at that point, I didn't realize what it was. But when I got home, I just noticed my parents' attitude. And it's years later that I realized that that was my first experience with racism. And I think the concern that my parents had of what I would be facing. And I would say that, I don't know when it was probably in the 80s, not to date myself, which I think I have at the bottom there. And then if we can go to the next slide, years later, when I moved abroad into the Dutch Caribbean, and this is the Dutch Caribbean, I cannot speak to the Netherlands itself. In the Dutch Caribbean, it was much more insidious. This idea that people could not do the jobs and you needed to import Dutch people. And it really didn't have to do with the fact that whether you were from the island or not, you just had to be living there. And what also disturbed me was the idea that many people accepted this without question, which led to them not wanting to discuss race. It was a taboo topic. And when I would talk about it, I was classified as the racist. I guess it's something that's very similar to here, but again, we can have we're having this discussion right now. And where I was living, we couldn't have this discussion. And when I started it, I actually lost friends. People who used to talk to me, they stopped talking to me because I decided to talk about this. And it's this experience that I write about in my book that's forthcoming. If you could go to the next slide. So, I mean, this is one of the people that has influenced me, Barbara Jean Fields. She's a historian. She used to be at Columbia, and she came up with this idea of racecraft, like witchcraft, I guess. It exists subjectively and has topological features that people navigate, and they do not really stop transversing it. It's not physical terrain, and it doesn't exist in nature, but in action and imagination. Action, let's say again, policy procedures that while they might not intend to have racial, they are racial because it's such a fundamental part of the structure, the foundation of our society. And I would extend that again to a lot of the colonial world, where and looking at, and you look at the decolonial dialogue, it's they may not mention race, but it's very similar to race. It's really a part of our lives. I mean, here in the United States, from birth to death, we classify ourselves racially. That have been disconnected, and it's canceled. Another, I don't know what happened, but my slides are gone. I can keep talking though. When you look at, there's this book called The Racial Contract, which is by, I think he's a philosopher. His name is Charles Mills, and this quote was actually in the advertisement for this actual workshop. And it's recognizing that racism is part of a political system. It's not just something that's floating around, it's embedded within our institutions. And I would argue further that it's embedded, with the practices of colonial, if you look at a lot of the development work, it's embedded within development dialogue, while they may not mention race. And there's a history to why they have not meant, it was actually almost eliminated from the dialogue. And you have other words, like in the United States, instead of saying a Black neighborhood, you say urban. So you soften the blow, but it's pretty much the same thing. So if you can go to the next slide. And here we're talking about institutional racism and systemic racism. And again, it's embedded within the normal practices of our society. And it leads to discrimination. I mean, everything, when you look at everything, everything seems to be broken to me sometimes. And I think that instead of treating the symptoms, we need to look at the root cause. And the root cause of this, I would easily say, is not only racism, but white supremacy. The fact that certain groups are seen as lesser and certain groups are seen as better. And the worst part of that, the ultimate part of that, is when people internalize that and begin to believe that themselves, and begin to believe themselves to be inferior, and therefore need the help of those who are cast as superior, even though in reality, there's really no difference. So, but as a result, when you look at this institutional racism, everything we have here, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, it can go on and on and on. And I just happen to use that picture because for all these years, I have been working in public health. And now people are saying that racism is actually a public health crisis. But I remember when I was in graduate school, and I used to say that, my professors always used to tell me, but how do you measure it? You know, we can't measure racism. So maybe now we're going to begin to see some serious dialogue around how to measure this. You can go to the next slide. And I just want to go through some influences, the things that have influenced my work. This is one, the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I think this is really, the author was from Brazil. And I mean, if you really think about it, if somebody believes that they're inferior, how does that impact their mental health? How does that impact, let's say, substance abuse? I think these are all questions that need to be asked. And again, we're looking at the root of the problem, not just treating the symptoms. And that's what we've been doing for years, even though people have been writing about it for years. But now we have this whole thing about anti-racism, and it seems like it's a new development. But in reality, the dialogue on this probably goes back longer than, it does go back longer than 100 years, because you had your Frederick Douglasses who were out there, arguing for equality and equity. So you can go to the next slide. Again, we're treating the symptoms and not the cause, and many ill mean that you can't have successful people of color. It doesn't mean that it's easy for all white people. That's very simplistic. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. But we still need to look at the symptomatic and the structural issues that are causing so many ills, not only in our society, but I think at this point the world, because the world is faced with many challenges, as we see with the pandemic. If you can go to the next slide, please. And just to give you some perspective, these are two books that were very influential. I think The Invention of the White Race was probably the first book. I can't attest to that. Specifically looking at the creation, the fabrication of the white race. And if we look at that, and that goes to Ignatiev's book, How the Irish Became White, how these categories are fluid. So the Irish, when they immigrated here, especially in the 1850s, they were Catholic, and they weren't accepted by the Protestants. They made a decision to be white because it would be more beneficial to them, because that's how they would have more opportunities if they became white. And therefore what you have is a shift from Protestants to terms of what white meant. And I want to just emphasize that, because these are cultural categories. They're not biological categories, but I mean, cultural categories can have an impact, have real impacts. We can go to the next slide. So this is just something that I kind of just jotted out some ideas quickly, where you have different movements, starting with this Doctrine of Discovery. Not many people discuss this because it was mainly a religious document, but it justified, it was written in the 1500s, and it justified, just going into countries and just taking over. And actually it's very active today, and a lot of Native American populations look at this Doctrine of Discovery to analyze what has been done to them. And from the Doctrine of Discovery, you had the movement of scientific racism, where people were actually, measuring things and saying, look how different people are. And a lot of times, if you look at a lot of Stephen Jay Gould's work on The Mismeasure of Man, he talks about bias, that, they went in with certain ideas and they came out with, they justified what they wanted to justify, even though it was totally unscientific. And then you move into the period of social Darwinism, and I would tag that up with the eugenics movement, which was this whole idea of the survival of the fittest, and that that was the idea, but then you moved into this idea that you needed to take those who were unfit out of society, which we know led to the whole Nazi movement. But the United States was very much involved in it, like I said at the beginning, in that, the Nazis based what they were doing on Jim Crow laws, primarily in the South. And then I don't know how to classify this late era, but you have this denial era of people saying, well, I'm not, it doesn't exist, it's in your mind. And then I have the impact, self-inscribed inferiority, self-hatred, systematic racism, structural racism, and ultimately the destruction of community and democracy. I mean, in reality, when we look at our communities, not just our communities, and we look at how much the lack of faith we have in democracy, I think that this can be tied back to to racism and white supremacy. But along all this, you have resistance. From the beginning, it's not like people sat idly and did nothing. And we need to acknowledge these people who came before us through anti-slavery, abolition, the Pan-African movement, the New Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance. And these are just basically those movements that focused on African Americans. There are other movements as well coming to these. So anti-racism didn't pop out of nowhere. It has a long history, and we need to really study this history. And as I said at the beginning, innovate through this history. If you go to the next slide, Du Bois, he's very relevant today This is a part of a speech that he read in 1900 at the first Pan-African Congress. He was thinking globally. This man got around in a time where you had to take ships, there was no internet, people actually had to write letter for correspondence. So if he could do it, we should be able to do it also. What's interesting about Du Bois, because he lived so long, he was able to, we have a record. I mean, he lived almost 100 years. And not only do you see his change in thoughts, but the arguments that he used against racism globally, not just, and he looked at, he was involved with, he included not only African Americans, but on the African continent, the Caribbean, the Indian continent, and poor whites. Because in reality, everybody was to a certain extent suffering, but these racial divisions kind of prevented them from uniting in a common cause. And if you go to the next slide, another person I think is interesting to read is Franz Fanon, who was he was a Caribbean psychiatrist from the French islands. I really don't remember, I should have looked this up. I think from Martinique. A lot of his work was in Africa. And he really talked about the impact of colonialism on the mindset of people who have been colonized. So very similar, but from different parts of the world and experiencing racism differently, but nevertheless racism. You can go ahead. And again, these are some books that have been come out just to show the global perspective. And since I did live within the Dutch Kingdom and I do represent the Baltimore-Rotterdam Sister Cities, these are some books that are very good reads if you want to learn more about race and racism in the Dutch Kingdom. You have, the first one is probably the last one listed, which is Dutch Racism, which is by Philomena Assed. She's, I think, originally from Suriname, including this book, White Innocence, which is by Gloria Wekker, who's also, I think, originally from Suriname, which are countries, it's an independent country, but it used to be colonized by the Netherlands. And then the newest book is Smash the Pillars by Weiner and Baez, and it's a series of essays talking about race and racism throughout the Dutch Kingdom. And I do have a few, myself and a few of my colleagues who participated in the first Raising the Curtain on Race conference have articles published in this book. So very good reads, very interesting. And that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't talk very fast. It was only supposed to be a brief overview, but you're welcome to contact me if you'd like to discuss it more or if you have a question at the end. Thank you. Unmute yourself, Karen.
Thank you very much, Teresa. You've given us a lot of good reading, and those books that you included in your presentation are on the reading list, and the link to that reading list is in the chat. And now I'd like to move to Diana Zilberman. Diana is our BSc education champion. She came to the United States in the 1980s from her native Romania. She completed her graduate studies in education at Johns Hopkins and taught English writing and literature for more than 20 years at Baltimore City Community College and Goucher College. She currently provides training and consulting on teaching and learning at a distance for colleges and universities. So obviously her skills are in great demand these days. Diana, welcome. And you're going to be showing your slides. And you need to unmute yourself. Oh, why?
Speaking now, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to this. I am going to share my screen now, so please bear with me just a moment. and it's subject to discuss, but I think that that's a great start. A few questions that we want to keep in mind. What is it? And what does it mean for white people and for people of other races? And why is it important for us to talk about this? So white privilege as a phrase was coined in 1980 by Peggy McIntosh, who was a researcher and also an activist and a scholar. And white privilege is an invisible force. As I was listening to Leslie speak, to Teresa speak before, I was thinking that all the points that she was making are a perfect segue for what I was going to say. White privilege is an invisible force, and it favors white people on many aspects of their lives. I might say it's a force that favors white people in all aspects of their lives. Many white people are unaware of this, and many white people are actually uncomfortable to talk about white privilege. They deny its existence, they don't recognize it, and if they are open to listening to a discussion, that's a great gain. So what was my personal experience and I was made aware of? So I'm a white person, born white, lived as white person all my life. I'm going to die as a white person. Generally, I had a good relationship with the police. So when I look for nude stockings, they match exactly the tone of my skin, and also Band-Aids. I never look at whitening skin creams. I don't need them. They don't interest me. And if I am in an exclusive store, I'm not followed. I'm just left alone to browse, to pick up items, to move them from one shelf to another. I have never difficulty hailing a taxi, and actually everybody would be more than eager than help me. A car would stop for me if I have a problem with a flat tire. So I can walk, on any street, and I've never seen anybody crossing the street to avoid meeting me face to face. And all the literature and the history that I have studied relates to me completely. I relate to it. Once my family moved to a new neighborhood, seems like everybody was pleased that we were moving there. And the last one, I do not need to teach my sons what to do or not to do if stopped by the police. And this is something that is very personal to me because my both sons are grown-ups, but when they were starting to drive, I was talking to my colleague at work, African-American colleague, who also had sons of driving age. And I was saying, oh, I am a nervous wreck. What about fender benders? What about, what are they safe when they drive? And she was saying, well, I have to talk to my sons about what they do if they are stopped by police. And I remember stopping in my track and thinking, I don't feel like I need to talk to my sons about that. If they are stopped by the police, they are stopped by the police. They'll show the driver's license and the registration card, and that's that. Well, as I was talking more with my colleague, her experience was completely different. So as Teresa was saying, white privilege makes a lot of white people very defensive. They say, oh, but I worked so hard for my success. I earned my success. And that is true. It doesn't mean that white people do not earn their success or they should not be proud of their accomplishment. And by the same token, there are a lot of white people who struggle with poverty, lack of housing, or adequate healthcare. So speaking about white privilege is not meant to make white people feel guilty. They should not feel guilty. It's just a very difficult discussion because it's really very difficult to organize, to recognize. So it's very difficult to recognize white privilege because for white people, what every aspect of their lives and what they see and where they move and what they do seems normal. That's their normal. And say, well, where, how, you know, why do we speak about that? And a lot of time, white people do not have that because they feel defensive and it's a subject that is hard to talk about. They cannot even listen to and try to understand what life is for Black, brown, or people of other races. So the dialogue is extremely important. And the bottom line is there should be much more listening, much more communication so that white people can would stand with Black and brown people for justice and equity. This is an article that has a lot of very good information and that has statistics that are drawn from today's reality and that show that household median net worth for white households and Black and Hispanic households is extremely divergent. So accumulating wealth has been a white privilege, and that goes from one generation to another generation to another generation. And because of overt systemic racism in basically all facets of lives, this is a system that perpetuates. As you see on the slide, even for people who go to college and people who spend less and save more, white people have 7.2 times more wealth than other people. And that is the reality. And a lot of times, if we do not dig deeper, if we do not go more granular to understand the causes, we might consider, well, you know, go back to that's a norm, that's that. Well, it should not be the norm. So this gap should be bridged. And unfortunately, to this day, it hasn't been. I am inviting you to watch a little bit of this video by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And I am going to start it, but actually it's a fairly long video. I want to start only at this minute.
It's taught us to treat everyone the same.
Let me stop and go back a little bit to my slide. As you listen to Dr. Robin DiAngelo, pay attention to this phrase, but I was taught to treat everyone the same way. And I have many Blacks. This is a lot of the things that white people say. And then what she says about conscious and unconscious bias. And then she's going to talk about the biggest threat that she sees in this chasm between whites and Blacks. So let me go back to the video. Okay, so sorry about that.
One is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I'm just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again. Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity. Okay? And that's why I have this image of a dock, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live of all of this, I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now of under the water. You see the pillars or posts that prop up the surface, okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color, okay? And so we're giving you evidence. Right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many people, white people, don't have people of color in close relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective. And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color.
Okay, so if you want to have to listen more to this presentation, which is quite long, and I strongly recommend it. It's we can send you the links, but also is Dr. Robin DiAngelo. So conscious and unconscious bias. The big threat, the big thing that we need to reflect on is the unconscious bias. As Dr. DiAngelo is saying, this is something that promotes the way we act, and this is what we need to be aware of. And one short video that I want to share with you, and it's how unconsciously racism is absorbed as for children at a very, very young age, is this next video, just a couple of minutes on it.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one,
Okay.
like dog.
Okay. So what does this video tell us? Young innocent children having absorbed the pervasiveness of racism, and of course it's completely unconscious. And that doll test was first done in the 60s, but it's been done also recently, and the vast majority of the children had the same reaction. And I am going to conclude with my story. White person, immigrant from Romania. And I have to say that there were no Black people in Romania, but there are a lot of gypsies in Romania, and the vast majority of bias and racism was against gypsies. I am a Christian, but I'm with a Jewish name, so I kind of felt Jewish, and I saw, and my children, you know, had some episodes where they were felt, you know, they were felt like, you know, they were put in a certain category. But the most important part of my story is that I taught at Baltimore City Community College, mostly Black students. And I always had absolutely wonderful relationships with them. And here I was, a white person with an accent coming from Romania, teaching them English, writing, right? But through the years, I understood that if I want to be a good teacher, I needed to earn my students' trust. And I couldn't do that unless I could open myself to the honest discussion with them about race. And I had to put it out there. I had to listen to them. And once I opened that door, I could feel that my students could trust me, and then I could teach them and they could learn. So that's my story. And thank you so much for allowing me to speak tonight.
Thank you very much, Diana, for sharing your personal story as well as those perspectives on white privilege. And perhaps if you have the links, you could perhaps put the links to those two videos, or particularly Robin DiAngelo, since that's a much longer one, put that in the chat, because her book, White Fragility, has become quite well known recently and is a very powerful book, and that's included on our reading list as well. And now we're going to come home to Baltimore with Geri Byrd, Baltimore Sister Cities Vice President and the Mayor's Office Representative to BSC. Geri grew up in Baltimore and graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park. She worked in the U.S. Treasury Department during the Obama administration and is now Deputy Chief of Staff for Mayor Bernard Jack Young. Geri will be joined by her colleague, John Wesley, who is Public Information Officer for the Mayor's Office of Equity and Civil Rights. Geri?
And Diana for sharing your stories and for providing such a wealth of information. Additionally to our entire Baltimore Sister Cities membership. And what I think is that this is an exceptional privilege for us, and I feel proud that we can have this discussion. And what's interesting is, you know, listening to everybody's story. Doing so, we are breaking up a lot of misnomers, or maybe some people thought certain things, or, you know, so I think this is a really good thing. So I want to say thank you for this. I think my pieces, I don't have a huge spreadsheet and a whole slideshow for tonight. I think I have one slide that Karen will help me with a little bit later, but really what I wanted to do was to just sort of share my personal experience and perspective of race in Baltimore. And also to be able to open the floor up to my friend and colleague, John Wesley, who serves as our Public Information Officer for Baltimore's Office of Equity and Civil Rights. And he will be able to add a lot of historical perspective. I think that when we talk about systematic racism in Baltimore, there are two things that come to mind. The term redlining and a conceptual that was introduced by Dr. Lawrence T. Brown, a former associate professor at Morgan State University, called the Black Butterfly and the White L. And so when I think about systematic racism in Baltimore, those are the two things that I think of. And like I'm saying, what I want to do is give you my perspective. You know, for those of you who might not know, redlining originated from the 1950s practice of color coding maps of cities based on different neighborhoods, based on the different neighborhoods' eligibility to receive loans or mortgages. The lowest ranked neighborhoods were often literally lined in red and were almost always a community of color or other marginalized identities. My story, my personal story in Baltimore is sort of like a tale of those two cities. It's a tale of those two cities and a tale of two different Baltimores. So I wanted to give you my perspective and allow Mr. Wesley to expand more on what Dr. Lawrence's research and conceptual really kind of teaches us. Because basically, when we talk about the black butterfly and the white L, what it depicts and references is Baltimore's majority Black population that sort of spreads like this to both sides of the real estate, the centered real estate that runs central to Baltimore City and expands to the east. And it creates this L, and we have this blossoming to the side, a butterfly wing. And growing up, my personal story is a part of that whole conceptual. Because for me, I grew up on the west side in Emerson Village as the baby sibling of 4. And I think what's interesting is I lived in a mostly majority Black population on the west side that wasn't always Black to some degree, not in the 50s. It was more of a white community when my parents moved there. But my experience growing up there was more of a dichotomy of two different worlds, because I didn't go to school in my neighborhood. I went to school, had this stark contrast of diversity between going to school in one neighborhood and then coming home to my one neighborhood that was not diverse. I went to a diverse school, mostly white, and then all Black in my neighborhood. And kind of what that did, and as a young person, when you grow up like that, you don't really realize what you're dealing with the dichotomy of two different worlds. You kind of learn this association of code switching in a way, where you operate in one area differently than you might operate in another. And so for me, you know, at school I was Geraldine, at home I was Geri. But I was always myself, but for me growing up, it was different to be home than it was to be at school. I could relax my dialect when I was home. Then I would get to school, I had to button it up. But at home, if I buttoned it up, they wouldn't understand what I was talking about in my neighborhood. So it was interesting and very, 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 growing up like that, just as a little kid, is something that not everybody has a story about. And see, that's my story, but not everybody who grew up in Baltimore's story. What I had to do mostly is learn just simply how to be myself on both fronts. And I think I can say that my mother was very, very instrumental in making sure that I had exposure, regardless of where I lived or what neighborhood, what resources we had in our neighborhood or not. She was a cosmopolitan woman from Chicago, and so my family moved here in the 50s from the big city, and I actually was the only one that was actually born in Baltimore. My siblings were maybe 5 and maybe 4 and 3, I think, when they moved. But my mother would do things like take me downtown to the big stores to be able to shop at downtown area and be able to like see some of the restaurants and things that were to give me that little piece of exposure, you know. My dad was a radio personality in Ohio, in Youngstown. And so when they moved to Baltimore, they moved to an area in Emerson Village during a heightened time of racism. And so subsequently, they had to deal with a whole lot in a neighborhood that was not very welcoming to them at all. My family was a Catholic family, and so the only church in our neighborhood was an all-white Catholic church, St. Bernardine's. So my mother tells me stories of having to try to get my oldest sister to be able to go through a catechism in that class. She was literally one of the first African-American children to actually get through to be able to go to that catechism class, because my mother literally had to take it all the way up to the bishop. And what I would say is that she and my dad were trailblazed into Baltimore, but even having to deal with systemic racism in Chicago from where they came, they were always of the mindset that you push, you persevere, and regardless of what the adversity is, you keep moving. My family was one that they all went to college. My mother went to college, my father went to college, and so did all my 4 siblings. In my family, it wasn't an option. And most of that was based on her family history and exposure. But regardless of how I grew up, if other people in my neighborhood may not have had the opportunity, they may not have had the exposure, but what my mother did was just instill on us that regardless of what our environment was, regardless of the adversity that we faced, we never stopped persevering and pushing forward. And I say all that to say, just because my story is different, you know, just a few of my friends in my community were fortunate enough to go to school and to be able to take things to the next level, and that wasn't everybody's story. But I say all that to say, and really what I wanted to really just drive home is that, you know, from my perspective and from what I had learned basically from my family, is that you always I was 25 from Baltimore. I was gone for 25 years. I worked up in Connecticut, Rhode Island at one time, and in Washington, dear in my heart. And so after Freddie Gray, I was not in the city at the time, I was in Connecticut. And for me, my personal story is that that experience near was get back here to be able to give back to my city in some capacity. And at that point, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what I was going to do. But for me, thus far, public service was and has sort of been my capacity and sort of to give back. And so without further ado, what I'd like to do is reintroduce a very incredible public servant in Baltimore who continues to remain committed to the city and to the cause. And that's John Wesley. And I'm happy he's here tonight to share. John.
Thank you so much, Geri. And it's great to be on with this incredible panel of smart women. I mean, this is amazing. I was listening to you, Geri, and your references to your mother. And just thinking about the fact that I am constantly reminded by the lady in my life of the great role that my grandmother played, you know, in my life. But it's very interesting that you would mention your mother, because African-American women began to educate their daughters at the turn of the century in the 1900s. So it is that for that reason that we have early in the 1900s, the AKAs, the Deltas, the NAACP, the Urban League, the Negro movement. If you look at all of those things, they followed that point. And one of the reasons is that it happened is that researchers determined that there were close to 4,000 people were killed for racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. If you just look at that period of time. Now, and I'm just trying to connect some dots with the different pieces that Teresa talked about and that Diana talked about, which to show you that this is a global situation. I mean, this whole issue of race. And I thought it was amazing, you know, how the Irish became white, you know, and I looked at that concept. And then that gave me a flashback to the repatriated German Jews who came here after they were dismissed by Hitler, and they came to the United States. There was a traveling exhibition called between Swastika and Jim Crow, and it came to the Reginald Lewis Museum. Okay, and it talked about how these repatriated German Jews were selected by W.B. Du Bois and his colleagues to help educate the talented 10th. Okay, so because there were not enough African-American educators at the time to people all the HBCUs that we had started and we wanted to populate. So we brought in these repatriated German Jews. As a matter of fact, the way that I got into college at Tougaloo was Dr. Ernst Berinsky, who was one of them. And I was going to a Job Corps program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and he says to me, "Young man, you're going to college." But when you look at that now, when Diana talked about the experience of the gypsies, very interesting. Cherry Hill in Baltimore was initially populated by gypsies, okay? And because they had an ordinance where they were charged like $1,000 for fortune telling. And it wasn't enforced that much, but they initially moved out of Cherry Hill because it was difficult for them to do their business. It was at that point that Cherry Hill then became the place where African Americans would live. So when you look at people like Judge Billy Murphy, he came out of Cherry Hill. You know, he went to school 160 in Cherry Hill. The interesting thing, though, and comes back once again, you, Geri, mentioned your mom. If you look at Cherry Hill, 160, your school, the assistant principal there was Enola McMillan. okay, who also became head of the NAACP, the branch here, grew the branch, and served on the board, okay? So when you begin to look at the pieces and you look at how the black butterfly, as you talk about it, and the white L is formed, and you look at things like, for instance, where the jobs are and where the money is concentrated. You know, people talk in Baltimore and they ask questions about the dollar houses. You know, people see all the vacant houses and they go, well, my goodness. But they don't realize that the dollar houses, the project worked because it was a part of the white L. Okay, you could take a house down in the inner harbor that was dilapidated and put $250,000 into it if you wanted to, if you could get the loan to rehab it. Why? Because you could sell it for $500,000. Okay, but you can't do that over in Park Heights. You know, I mean, then you're getting into the butterfly. Okay, so we have to look at the institution of racism, but we also, I think it's important that we look at, on the positive side, what has been done over time to begin to at least bring us to the point where we can have this kind of dialogue. I mean, this is great that we can have this kind of dialogue, because at one time you could not have this. Talk about the things that you didn't do. That I grew up with that in the Delta, Mississippi. I grew up in the Delta, Mississippi. Haven was God. I was there when SNCC came, you know, which was the result of the work by Ella Baker, and I was president and vice president for the Democratic Party. And you realize that Kamala Harris mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer. And then Joe Biden mentioned Ella Baker, okay? Once again, Geri, you refer to your mom, because when we look at the role that women have played in the evolution of curing this whole issue of race, well, we haven't cured it, but at least they're helping us to deal with it, okay? And the key element, key component of that, I think, is dialogue. The final thing I want to say about this, and then because we got some questions, Geri, you talked about growing up in Evanston Village, how you had one way that you related at home and one way that you related where you went to school. Well, isn't that right out of what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about when he talked about developing this dual language, okay? It has been necessary over time for us to develop a dual language and a dual way of living. One of the things that people are rebelling against now in protest is that people, you know, a lot of people are saying, wait a minute. My models matter too, because the idea of Black Lives Matters. My model matters too. So why should I adopt your model in order to survive when I respect mine, and I respect my heritage and my culture and my people and all of that. So when you look at it in terms of what the city is doing, and we'll come to a close on this, in terms of embracing equity, okay, that is our mantra in Baltimore, to deal with all of these issues put together by embracing equity. And I'm happy to say that Mayor Young started the process, and the Democratic nominee, Brandon Scott, is making it a major part of his platform and major part of his campaign. So I'll stop at that point, and if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them, but I'll stop and let you all discuss more. But thank you so much for inviting me to be a part.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you to all of you who spoke. We do have some questions, and I encourage everybody to put their questions into the chat. The first question, it referenced Teresa mentioning that many Black people have internalized racism. And her question is, what practical steps can a Black person take to dismantle internalized racism once he or she has recognized it? And I would add to that, and this could be, you can answer either question, how do white people go about recognizing implicit bias in themselves? So 2 questions there, and Diana, you put an answer in the chat, but I'll let you speak it as well, an answer to one or both parts of that question.
Okay. So yeah, so I would say that first of all, there should be dialogue, and there should be reflection. What I learned, for instance, is that I cannot take things for granted. So I need to recognize that there are certain things that appear completely normal to me, but not normal to other people. So I need to be a better listener. I need to show more empathy, and I should not shy away from open dialogue. So I think that that is a way, but you know, kind of finding one's identity and establishing a positive self-image is a lifelong process. So this is something that I think that a lot of Black mothers now have. They develop a positive self-image for their children, and a lot of white mothers as well. But I think that we could be doing more in having this kind of dialogue and moving away from our personal discomfort. And kind of be able to face it, you know, with be able to be very good listeners and be able to understand what the other people may feel.
If I can contribute to that, I know where that question came from. We are international tonight, and that question came from some people listening in Trinidad. And I want to say that I mentioned Pan-Africanism earlier. And gave kind of credit to Du Bois, but it was actually a Trinidadian who started the Pan-African movement, which is very interesting, back in 1900. In terms of, it's very difficult in my experience, among populations of African descent or African diasporic populations, especially with my experience it's everywhere. And I think, again, it goes to knowledge. People have to have a knowledge. People need to be raised with a sense of pride, of which I was. And it does, again, Geri, you mentioned it, it goes back to my mother, who was also an HBCU graduate from Fisk University. But and that's what we're trying to figure out at RCR, at Raising the Curtain on Race. It's trying to compile data from past thinkers, we call them race men and race women, and trying to compose curriculums. And how it would be set up is that these curriculums would be targeted to the particular areas, or targeted locally. So we can't say that the approach that we use here in Baltimore will work in, let's say, in Trinidad, for example, or there's people here from Curacao as well. We can't say that that would work, but the first step would be to find those people who see the issue, who want to study the root of the problem. And are tired of just looking at and treating the symptoms, and to again, look at what has been done before and come out with innovative ways. And innovation doesn't mean creating something new. It just means putting a spin on it, kind of. So the first step would be to find those people who identify the problem. And then the second step, I think, is creating some type of curriculum to transfer knowledge. But there's heavy resistance. In my experience, there's been heavy resistance with people who are internally racially oppressed and kind of don't want to hear it. So it's difficult, but I think the first thing, study your local context. And hey, you know, we're willing to work with you at Raising the Curtain on Race, because this is what we want to do, because we see it as that important. If I could say this, I was reading Caste, the new book by It's in the evening, so my mind kind of shuts down. By Wilkerson, I can't remember the first name. And one of the things she said is she was giving a talk, and a student from the continent, country in Africa, said to her, "But I'm not Black. You know, in Africa, we're Igbo, we're Yoruba." Maybe she was from Nigeria. I don't know. And the first thing that came to my mind is there are two parts of race. You know, there is how you're identified, how you identify personally, and how others identify you. So while you may not consider yourself Black, and it's okay to have that pride in your particular ethnic group, the policies, the development policies that are being applied to the continent of Africa have racial undertones. So it's just a kind of a different way of looking at it, but it always goes back to dialogue, but sometimes you have to bring people to the point where they can have the dialogue, because there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of suffering, and that comes out in chronic diseases, that comes out in substance abuse, that comes out in all different ways. So we have a long way to go, but we can't stop. We can't stop. We have to keep marching forward. Hope I answered your question.
And the next question sort of goes to what you were talking about, Teresa. And I'm going to read the whole question. Okay, what's next? We keep talking about racism and race. When will the dialogue end and the real action begin? What's the plan? We're preaching to the choir. When do we start working pews?
Well, I mean, we have to keep talking about it. That doesn't stop. But the action again is creating the curriculums, building the institutions that will fight this problem. It needs to be, we need to build, as we have institutions, you know, here we have our HBCUs. A lot has been made of HBCUs since with Kamala Harris being a Howard grad, and I'm very proud of that. I mean, Howard formed me, it really did. But we're always doing things. And that's the point. We've been doing things. Listen, African Americans have been doing things for almost 200 years. And it's not just African Americans. You have Equiano, who I can't remember the name of the book, but he fought. He was born on the continent, and then he wrote a book about his experience because he freed himself. So it's not like we're just talking. This has been going on for years. This isn't something that just began yesterday. This is something that we are continuing, and we can continue to fight. We will continue to bridge and build. I think that is what needs to be done. So this Baltimore discussion is really the third discussion in 3 different countries. Well, if you can, yeah, I would say 3 different countries. And that's something. And we have people from Curacao here. We have people from the Netherlands here, or from the Netherlands in origins. People are listening. And the more we discuss these things and collaborate and build money, we need money to do this kind of work. You know, we can't just do this for free. So we have to think of innovative ways to make money and provide people opportunities, let people publish books, that type of thing.
Any other comments from our other panelists on sort of action steps and for us as individuals, as well as for us as an organization, as BSC? Geri?
No, I mean, what I was really going to just add is that I think that the fact that we've opened up a forum like this to actually have a discussion and bring everybody to the table who has interest, I think is actually taking a step, right? Mm-hmm. I think that in most organizations, communities, cities, states, wherever, it comes down to what you've done, right? This might well be the first thing that BSC has done, right? So it won't be the last. So everybody is at a different stage, yes, and a different step of what they have done, okay, toward the cause, toward this. And our first step here is having this dialogue. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's what we reflect on.
Mm-hmm.
Another question goes to children. At what age do you think children should start to be taught about race and discuss issues about race and U.S. society, either by their parents or by the school system?
That's a tough one.
Well, I can only speak from my personal experience. It was discussed in my house from, I think, ever since I remember. We had flashcards, and it's not just talking about racism, it's talking about being proud of who you are. So you don't look at that black doll and say that one's bad and that one's ugly. I think it's really, and my grandfather was a teacher. I come from a history of educators. So you know, it was always discussed, and we were always taught to be proud of who we were. And I think it really should begin with that, because once you have a sense of who you are, I think you talked about that, Geri, you know, nobody can define you. You are, who you come to be. And I think that, I think that's the first step. And then you can begin talking about discrimination.
It's it, yeah. John?
He's
Diana?
muted.
John wanted to comment.
Yeah, but he's muted.
John?
Karen?
John, can you unmute yourself? I'm not able to do that.
Okay, yes. Yeah, well, two things I want to add. First of all, the education piece is very important. I mean, the most important thing you get is getting early education. How soon should we start? Well, my grandmother started when I was 4 and 5 years old. But to use a modern day example, when you talk about education, I think back to, we know about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We know that Mrs. Hamer led the walkout of the Democratic Convention in 1964, and that basically changed the way the delegates were selected for national conventions. But if you take a glimpse at what it looked like to get those people to understand how to function at same way you see at the Democratic Convention. And they voted, and they had their platform and all of that stuff. So that was education. And when they were teaching how that worked in the churches, of course they couldn't do it in the schools. Mrs. Hamer and her friends did it in the fields, okay? So the education piece of it, and my point is that we have the models there.
Yes.
We have the models to do this, okay? So all we have to do is to continue to build on the models that are already there. That's all I want to say about that.
No, thank you. I have a question. I was reading recently and realized, probably should have known it, that whiteness has been built into American policy since the Naturalization Act of 1790, which restricted citizenship to any alien being a free white person who had lived in the United States for at least 2 years. But it specifically mentioned a white person. And I would be curious, and perhaps Diana is the one to answer this, do any other countries have race written into their constitution and their sort of reason for being in the way the United States does? Or is this whole concept of race almost, even though other countries have other ways of segregating people and discriminating against different populations, as you mentioned, the Romani in Romania, do other countries have race and deal with race the way we do, Diana?
They were going through school, there were children who were from gypsy families, but they were never saying that, you know, what is your race? It was an unwritten kind of thing. It's also very interesting that the way a small Eastern European country was viewing the rest of the world was mostly through history and culture. And coming to the United States, the first time I had to fill out a form and I was asked about, you know, what is your race? And it said Caucasian. That was the first time I heard that I am Caucasian. I was not aware of that. So this is something that, in a way, it's imprinted in our DNA as people because we are tribal. And the tribalism is everywhere, you know, and then there are always these tensions. But when it's something that is systematically included in a history, that's a completely different story. I don't know if I answered the question now, but you know, it would be interesting to have on our panel maybe sometime in the future somebody who came to the United States as an immigrant from an Asian country, for an African country, from another country, and see how that experience was. For me, it was mostly cultural. I was, like for my students, I was completely strange bird. They had no idea what to make of me. But in a way, I could take that, I could make that, you know, I could turn that to my advantage.
And we do have another question. Is there a Black vision for America? What is there a vision of what the Black community would want America to be in 2020, 2030, as we look ahead?
Equitable.
Right. Right. I think everybody wants the same. I mean, I think that the good thing about having conversations like this and having forums like this is to understand that we're more the same than we are different, right?
Exactly.
We all want the same things as people who live in this wonderful country, not different, you know, and just because we might live in one community over the other, we all live in cross communities. So I think that, you know, discussions like this, you know, make us realize that we are more alike than we are different. So I think that what we can take away from that is that we want the same things. We all want equitable things to that extent, you know.
And it goes back to the idea that of the ideology of racecraft. You know, there's no validity to these categories, but we have held on to them, and they have created so much division. And really, when you look past it, like you said, Geri, we all want the same chances for our children. We don't want, you know, it's not fair for one, like I have sons, I have to worry about if my sons go out, if the police are going to bother them. I don't want to have to do that. We want the same things.
I think we're about to close, but a couple of comments. A comment from one attendee. Despite our strong segregation and deep inequity here in Baltimore, Baltimore can also be a symbol of inspiration in the world. Recently, there was a news story in Dutch news, and they referred to Baltimore as a place of strong Black activism. We have a history here of activism, both historical with Frederick Douglass and current, that can be promoted in the United States and across the world. And as Teresa mentioned, the history of resistance can be celebrated, and it can be something to be proud of. And we can note also that this week when we're speaking is the anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which will be remembered with another march to Washington later this week. Many of his remarks in that speech are repeated over and over, but I'm going to close with words from that speech that we hear less often, and remember that he said this in 1963. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. With that, I thank you all for attending, and I'll be sending emails with the links that you may not have gotten in the chat, and we look forward to your suggestions for another conversation. And thank you again to all of our panelists and to all of our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Have a good night. Thank you.